Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to be here. Thank you for all the panelists for being here. I know members have been in and out for different things. I do want to make a comment about, the last several of us have talked about tax rates and talked about revenue versus spending. One of the statistics, maybe even I think is more important than rates itself, is what are the actual tax revenues that the federal government collects. And the Congressional Budget Office, which is our scorecard, when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in 2017, CBO estimated that in 2022, we would collect $4.0 trillion in tax revenue. Now that 2022 is passed, even after working through COVID, we actually raised $4.9 trillion. So we actually received over $900 billion in tax revenue after Tax Cuts and Jobs Act because of people being able to have that economic growth and activity there. So that's one of the things I just wanted to highlight as far as tax revenue and the net impact of good economic policies. Jumping back into, I know I don't have much time here, the fiscal state of the union. I was a little concerned about some of the comments earlier. Let's see, I heard from the panelists that the fiscal state of the union is not good, that it's embarrassing, that continuing increasing debt to GDP drives up the actual interest rate that the federal government has to pay for borrowing, which tells me that we need to make sure that we stop borrowing as much through that process. So I looked at some statistics. Our federal government borrows $1 out of every $5 it spends this year. 1 out of every 5. And President Biden's budget proposed to increase that next year to borrow 1 out of every $4 that's being spent. It adds $17 trillion to the national debt. Never before has a U.S. president proposed to add $17 trillion to the deficit in 10 years. And they try to talk that it's actually a $3 trillion cut in the deficit because they're not raising it $20 trillion. So that just doesn't make sense from where we are today to where we need to be going into the future. Also, the spending programs have had massive negative impact on families and businesses. Inflation's up 14% on average. Things that are critical on a day-to-day basis, like food's up 20%, energy's up 37% for gas and heating our home. I want to talk through, I've got a couple questions here I hope I can get to about all of those. Is one of the challenges year after year, spending outpaces our revenue. It's unsustainable. It's unsustainable in our personal lives, unsustainable in business, unsustainable for state and local governments. Yet the borrowing that we do is $47,000 a second in terms of the federal government borrowing. So, which obviously, as I mentioned before, had an impact on interest, crowds out capital for in funding other programs as well as funding the economy. Professor Taylor, our current net interest spending is about 8% of federal government budget. It's expected to go to 14% by 2033 and 24% by 2053. Do you agree with assessment, and what challenges do you foresee in the next 10 years when about 1/6 of our budget is on interest alone?
Well, these numbers are very concerning. That's why I emphasize so much to get the budget deficit down so we don't accumulate so much debt. And the question for you is, how fast do we do that? How do you convince your colleagues one way or the other? Personally, I think the faster the better, because it's so large at this point. And that will deal with the problem you're indicating. The exact amount are hard to calculate, but it'll deal with the problem you're indicating, and that's what you should do.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Walker, my colleagues, particularly on the other side of the aisle, have indicated that there's no real correlation between some of the massive amounts of spending and the interest rates being near 40-year highs. Can you help us walk through how those are related?
Economics 101. Too much spending has resulted in additional deficits. Additional deficits increases debt to GDP, slows economic growth. That has been facilitated in part by the Fed, which had very loose money policy with regard to interest rates and also bought a lot of our Treasury securities. That resulted in excess inflation. That resulted in the need to increase interest rates. That resulted in some of the things that frankly led to the fall of these two banks recently and uncertainty in the banking system. sector. It's all interconnected, okay? And by the way, the two major things are too much spending and the 180-degree reversal on energy policy. We were energy independent. That's not just with regard to energy prices. It's with regard to agricultural. I mean, you know, fertilizer is relied on that. So those two things, get control of spending and get back to energy independence are the two important things. You are going to have more revenues as a percentage of GDP. The math doesn't work without it. The question is, how do you get there? Pro-growth policies, how do you do tax reform where you can generate more revenue as a percentage of GDP? Spending is the primary problem, overwhelmingly, but it's not the only problem.
Well, thank you, and thank you all. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.